Welcome to the Athos Diet Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Timothy Patitsas. He's a graduate of Georgetown University, graduate of the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, and a PhD of Catholic University. He's a writer, movie producer, dean of Hellenic College, and an author. His latest book is The Ethics of Beauty, which takes a beauty-first approach to examining and experiencing much of life. He's here today to explore his first chapter on war, entitled The Opposite of War is Not Peace, interestingly. We spoke for an hour on many topics such as the inevitable moral injury of war, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the fractals of these principles as they apply to the emergency department where I work. Dr. Timothy Patitsas is a professor, a personal friend, and my uncle. Please enjoy our conversation together. All right. So here we are on the Athos Diet Podcast. I have a fantastic guest today who not only do I follow on a professional level, but a personal level. My Theo, or Uncle Timothy Patitsas, he is a doctorate of theology, and is the dean of Hellenic College. And he is calling in from Boston, no less, and I am calling in from central Pennsylvania. I welcome you to the show, Uncle Tim.
Good to see you, Dr. Pete. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it is kind of a funny thing here. You know, we have a Dr. Patitsas and a Dr. Patitsas. So,
I think technically, PhDs are really just supposed to be called professors, and it's sort of just a courtesy that we get called doctor. I mean, we certainly have a doctorate, but I think there is.
Yeah. I think we all play our role in shepherding our patients and pupils through the process of life. We just hit them at different parts. So I am so excited to talk to you about a book that you wrote not too long ago, The Ethics of Beauty. And it is a very catching cover, by the way. I find that the color itself is very warm, it's very inviting. And I don't know if the point that there's sort of this black perimeter with this very golden center. And somehow I find that sort of light within the darkness. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I immediately saw that and thought, wow, this seems warm and welcoming in a halo of darkness. Is any truth to that interpretation?
Yeah, I think that is one of the earliest depictions in art of Christ, of Jesus Christ, of our Lord and Savior. It's from a wall painting, one of the catacombs in Rome. I think it's early 2nd century or something like that. So certainly it's in a dark place that you have to bring a candle down to see.
Yes.
And we wanted to capture that. In fact, some of the schemes we played around, we were like holding there was a candle in the picture, and that just seemed really tacky. So
yeah.
So we settled on this. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't want any Hallmark cards on the front of the book of this size. So I was so attracted to this book and to its title, and particularly the first chapter. And my goal today is literally trying to do some justice to that first chapter, which is honestly an absolute paradigm shift to anything I've ever heard about war. So just to bring the audience up to speed here. So we're talking about The Ethics of Beauty book written by Dr. Timothy Patitsas, and we are exploring the first chapter, which is no less entitled The Opposite of War is Not Peace. The Opposite of War is Not Peace. And I'm very excited to talk to you about this because I find many parallels between your descriptions of war, trauma, and frankly speaking, my experience in the emergency department, where actually healthcare workers, and we've had 2 years of this in particular, dealing with COVID, and whether it's 100% factual or not, just how extreme conditions are or have been in our emergency departments across the country. We are all dealing with these feelings of burnout, which is a generic term, but really what it captures is this almost like a post-traumatic stress disorder of being in the field that we're in. And as you're speaking about many of these issues with war, I see absolute connections and parallels with with my daily experience and with the colleagues and great people that I work with every day. So I'm very excited to talk to you about this, only if anything, only to sort of help find more help and support in my own daily life. But so amazing that this microcosm of my experience can sort of be scaled up to entire nation states fighting one another, and no less in the backdrop of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict.
Oh yeah, it's a whole nother thing. Yeah, in a terrible situation. Yes, some people with combat experience have described this book as the voice of the American soldier. And considering that I don't have any combat experience or military experience myself, that was really, I almost don't know how to react to that. But it really has struck a chord with a lot of people. Of course, I was building off two specific books, but in particular one, another Boston area person named Jonathan Shea, who wrote Achilles in Vietnam. And when I heard that title shortly after it came out, I didn't read it for another 12 years or something, but I just loved that title, Achilles in Vietnam. And Jonathan Shea is an MD, PhD, and psychiatrist, and an expert on the brain chemistry, actually. But Achilles in Vietnam, he describes traumatic experience, and I was able just to see that, that from an Orthodox Christian perspective, what he describes is a kind of progressive excommunication of the trauma sufferer. And certainly for medical workers, the moment you're called the heroes or the frontline heroes, that's a praise, but it's already saying, you're over there from the rest of us. Go die on our behalf. We expect you to, somehow work a miracle or somehow pay with your own life to protect society from this mystery illness. And
which is a war context in a sense. That those parameters sound like war, right?
It's a war context, and it's in a way it integrates you into the community. Like, oh, this is my role. I'm the hero. But in some other way, it separates you. And then as time goes on, and you're just going beyond your limit week after week and month after month, you experience a progressive detachment from the larger society. I gained 30 pounds during COVID. For me, it was a position of, relative ease in some sense. Of course, it was stressful for me too, but
it is fascinating to some extent that one of the reasons that we were able to do a lockdown, like that we even could consider it, was the fact that we had the technology to do so. It's only because we could that we did. If we didn't have Amazon, if we didn't have internet and mass communication, Zoom, etc., we would have just had to say, hey, I guess we're just gonna take our chances and keep living, which you could say is to some extent might have been better than a severe lockdown. But it's interesting that sometimes just because you can, you do. I wanted to comment. The first thing that struck me about this was the first page. Honestly, this book is just packed with material, but this first page creates this description almost of this pre-game celebration of war. At least, that's how I would have assumed that's what I'm looking at. A whole bunch of soldiers lining up, celebrating the fact that they're about to go take on the mission, complete what they need to do, get it done, come home and celebrate with their victory. And to me, even being, Greek, Orthodox, family oriented, etc., that was my understanding of kind of like what the pregame was all about. But you, in fact, go on to describe that in Orthodox cultures and countries, this bringing together of soldiers to a ceremony of prayer, to get blessings, etc., was more of one of support, protection, and building them up before they go out to do the ultimate deed, which was participating in war and perhaps murdering other of their fellow mankind.
Sure.
In my mind, that was such a strong change of interpretation, because to some extent, I'm looking at, in a certain sense, the same view of these soldiers lining up and putting on their uniforms and trying to posture. And really what in some of these Orthodox countries, what they were doing is preparing them for a spiritual battle and one of spiritual warfare. Tell me more about that that layout.
Well, certainly, historically, soldiers on the eve of combat, they're going to fear death. And so some message about the resurrection and that, God's care is an important psychological and spiritual equipping. You're going to fear, will I be able to function and be brave? And again, to turn to God to ease those fears and unlock, who you are. There's this great saying that, in combat, you do not rise to the occasion. Rather, you sink to the level of your training. So we don't want, going into a combat situation or some kind of a stressful situation, let's say in an emergency department, to have an emotional outburst of something, but rather we want to clear away that anxiety and excitement and rely on our training and rely on what we know, the checklists that will save us, and that to the extent that anything can in worldly terms.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because in my experience, when I talk to my colleagues who are in the emergency department, I say, hey, what music do you listen to on your way to work? Some of them do listen to hyped up music, like they are getting ready for battle, and of course they're driving, like a Lincoln or something doing it. But, the point is that they are trying to hype themselves up to get ready for this very intense shift. I myself, though, I probably unconscious, but maybe now conscious now that you highlight this, I often tend to say my morning prayers then and listen to some type of chanting. I used to think prior to reading this book, what I was doing was trying to pray for like mercy, that the shift wouldn't be that bad. But perhaps what I'm also doing is preparing my soul to some extent for the aftermath of processing that day, that experience. And so again, I go back to this display that you describe about the war.
Right, and that's, I haven't even gotten to your most important point.
Yeah, sure.
That you've got to protect. We're trying to protect soldiers spiritually, because they're not only are their conscious mind and their physical bodies at risk, but their souls are at as well. The things that they see that may happen to those whom they love, maybe they love more than anyone else they've ever loved, a partner in the struggle of war. The things that they'll be asked to do or will accidentally do or accidentally participate in, those things represent a danger to your moral state and the integrity of your character. And that's Shea's point, that combat trauma can unravel the character. And that's why I, as an ethicist, got interested in his work. I mean, it's not the biographical reason, but it's how it links to ethics.
Yeah,
what does it do to your character?
That phraseology of going berserk, I always kind of knew that term was like, oh, the guy went berserk and he just lost his mind and he's sort of unnecessarily risking himself and he just, kamikaze all the way. But the way that you go on in your book to describe how that's an unraveling and an isolation of the character, like Achilles, once Pericles is murdered, going out and just for the sake of vengeance and destruction. It reminds me almost of Jordan Peterson talking about, the kids at Columbine and how extreme people can feel when they go from being resentful to then, sort of explore this dark side of themselves, and they just want to destroy everything, themselves and everyone with it. It's no wonder they commit suicide at the end, because they're, it is a destruction of the self, like just playing out. But you're kind of describing that as well.
So that's Jonathan Shea's, observation that it's sort of at the end of this stage of unraveling can come for some, a berserk state. And for some, that kind of a fundamentally berserk orientation, he thought, could last months or a year or more. the hardness of life in combat can impact the character and is a kind of a deadening. And that relates to ethics and to all our experience, because Shea brings in Aristotle, who said that the natural habitation for human beings is the city, where we meet other equals and we strive together for virtue, and we keep each other in check, and we learn healthy limits. But Aristotle said gods and animals can live outside the city. And what Shea notes is that the berserker is one part God and one part animal, but they're excommunicated not only from the city and from others, but from their own humanity. So that's where the excommunication becomes. Now, the final excommunication that we want to avoid is the excommunication of the soul from the body, that occurs in death. Because however down the road that any of us has gone in internalizing rage and to the point of berserk states, and many of us probably have that, as long as we're still, en zoe, as we say in Greek, or still in life, there's a chance for us to come back to ourselves.
I thought it was a powerful statistic, speaking of, suicide as the ultimate outcome of this line of thought, really, or way of life. Since World War II, more people have died from suicide in Great Britain than they have from any armed conflict, in terms of war, since World War II. So, in a certain sense, it's a sad statistic, that so many in times of peace, no doubt, are in their own microcosm unraveling and ultimately deciding to disconnect.
Yes, this is the one of the big themes of the book is liturgy, and the way that we want to avoid our own or others' excommunication from the urban liturgy, and we want to, from the social liturgy, bring people back together. To be part of the liturgy, you have to have a priestly mentality. You have to be able to to offer something at your own expense, which is a kind of priestly act. And the whole point of trauma for an Orthodox Christian is the way that priestly character of the person steadily diminishes and finally is just kind of inoperable. And then in this kind of weird pagan dark, echo of that, then we make some final sacrifice of the self through suicide. But this is not pleasing to God, and certainly not pleasing to me or to anyone who loves you. And we want, people who hear this podcast, and you are loved, and we want you back, in the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I deal with people that are considering suicide every day, maybe 2 or 3 people sometimes, that are coming in, off the street, from their homes, whatever the context is, and they're committing this, considering this ultimate act. And I have to say, and maybe you could help me develop the terminology to say this more politely, but sometimes this might come across extreme, but I'm dealing with ways to make an actual difference for these people. Like sometimes I see people coming back time after time with the same issues. And every once in a while you hear about someone actually doing, the ultimate act, suicide. But, would it be too harsh for me to tell a mother of 5 girls that her committing suicide is murder against herself and neglect of her 5 children in the future? I mean, I have never said that, but I've thought about it. I don't want to add punishment to an already broken person, but I'm just wondering, how can I take that scenario and try to bring an Orthodox perspective to them in terms of why their pathway or their trajectory that they're taking is not a good one, without punishing them so much in my terminology or in the way I speak to them. Yeah,
it's a terrible thing. I mean, if we feel excommunicated by society and by God, like we feel that God doesn't care or isn't listening or isn't at any rate effective in offering what we need, what we think we need. If we're neglected by society or what have you, we not only internalize rage, but some amount of guilt. We feel that maybe on some level we deserve that, and it's kind of an offering. I will lower the burden to society by and it is the truth at any rate. I don't know, depending on the mental state of the person. I mean, hopefully anyone listening to this right now is in a mental state to hear that that act of suicide actually inflicts a huge burden on the survivors. It's a huge loss to society in general. It's a tremendously confusing, wake of confusion. There's got to be some other way for us to regain a productive place in society besides, getting rid of a problem for them because it doesn't do that anyway.
It's funny to me too, because in some ways you could say, oh, well, the person who is less productive, has less connections per se in society is the one that's more prone to consider suicide. But I've regrettably found out that some of the highest suicide rates in the country are actually among healthcare workers. And
they're trying so hard to work hard and justify their contribution, I assume, right? And so they're
yeah,
but we live in this Calvinist culture where we have renounced salvation through works and embraced salvation through work. Paul Farmer, who tragically died, a month ago in Rwanda, and I always, whenever I referred to him, I always made a point of saying the most important man in Boston. He died at the age of 62. But
I heard about him.
He said, in his book, he said, the young Harvard doctors who come to help me in Haiti that time, he says, most of them are atheists or unreligious, but they do have one God, and that God is the God of personal efficacy, which he meant was they wanted to believe that they were making a difference, and that they, through their intellect and talents, that they were kind of change makers in the world. And that kind of Calvinist spirit, is throughout the culture. Everyone feels like they've got to be doing more than they're doing. But why do healthcare workers have a rate of suicide? I didn't know that. Is it the trauma of what they face as well?
I mean, it's a great question, and I wrote an article once on my perspective on it, which started out with a tale of, I'm sure you know this story of the traveler going through the stone quarries. So the traveler is walking down the road and he sees a man in a stone quarry just working him, sweating, perspiring, working as hard as he can with his hammer. And the traveler asks the stone quarry man, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the guy's like, "Can you leave me alone? I'm trying to break these rocks, And so the traveler continues on down that road and sees another man. This man's not quite as upset and angry and perspiring, but he's still working hard. And he asks him, "Sir, what are you doing?" He's like, "Hey, I don't have time to talk right now. Can't you see that I'm really trying to smooth these rocks out in the right formation? This is technical work." And then he goes on to the third gentleman who's in the stone quarry working. This guy's like whistling while he works, pride in his stride, happy as ever. And the traveler says, "What are you doing, sir?" And he says, "Oh, I'm building a cathedral." And I took that story to mean in my line of work that the people who tend to last the longest and do their best are the ones that really see the why behind why they're working the way they are. And the people who tend to just think they're doing another shift, or maybe they're at best doing something technically savvy, tend to burn out faster. And I brought up a specific memory of mine. It was a pretty sad story, actually. But it was a gentleman who was on I-80 in a big 18-wheeler who, for whatever reason, lost control of his truck. And he was flown through the window. He ended up like 50 feet in front of his truck. And by the time the ambulance staff got there, like he basically told them his name and then he collapsed, which is never a good sign. Blunt trauma and syncopizing after a brief state of consciousness is pretty much like a death sign, a very poor prognosis. anyway, this gentleman was brought into the emergency department, into the trauma bay. I mean, I was there. There were probably 25 people doing one thing or another to get this guy, back to life. Chest tubes, mass blood transfusion protocol, pressors, interosseous access, and all these things you could talk about. And in about 15 minutes of the best CPR and the best of Western medicine, we totally failed. We totally failed. And then the most bizarre thing that happened was that just like that, everyone dispersed, maintenance comes in, we go out, next patient, back to business. And it was, what I noticed was that this racing from trauma to trauma was very taxing because you didn't have any time to process anything. And when I read your book about how, in the Iliad, how some of these men, when they died, they had like mourning periods of 7 days, 9 days, 10 days. I ended up looking this up. When the prophet David, King David, died in the Old Testament, they had 30 days of mourning. I mean, we get like 3 seconds of mourning, and I thought that also contributed to burnout, that we didn't have time to process what was going on. We were on to the next thing, and we kind of had to ignore this like touching of our soul temporarily. Like we felt something, the whole group felt something, but we weren't allowed to process it or speak about it, not because someone was trying to do that, but because there just wasn't any time. On to the next battle. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, the whole culture, we talk about this in chapter 7 of the book, the way, I won't even say the ancients, just rather the universal view of human society is that a healthy society is a wedding between two differing and largely conflicting approaches to social ethics. And one is that we are ruled by is the merchant who's innovative and efficient and productive and fast. And the other approach is the guardian, the governmental, that's slower, more process oriented, is going to allow for redundancies and backups. Not everyone has to be employed to the max at every second. Mm-hmm. And this was the universal view of human society. Excuse me. I just got my screen just went blank here a second.
I still see you fine.
Yeah, so they have to be reconciled through love, because otherwise there's no way for them to make sense of themselves. They both are so different that they naturally are kind of at war. Mm-hmm. So that's the old wedding liturgy view, and liturgy has this sense of everyone working together, but it also, as we know, in our own faith tradition, it's really big on Sabbath, and Sabbath at fractal scale. That there are whole seasons where we struggle more, and seasons where there's some kind of release of the fasting, release of the time in church, of the penitent emphasis. And in a fully merchant society, where that what's sometimes called that trader syndrome, TRADE, trade, yeah. The trade syndrome, money never sleeps, capital never sleeps. The asset is depreciating constantly, day and night. So the emphasis is you must work all the time. And that gives lots of people burnout, in every profession. And it's, but I mentioned Calvinism as sort of, making us all into such, busy beaver works. But the Calvinist church, in its ascendancy, it guarded Sabbath days, days when there was no commerce. It guarded some sense of Sabbath, and it's up to us, to use our freedom and our willpower to recover Sabbath, as I said, at fractal scale.
I love that perspective, because I think what it recognizes is the importance of the inevitability of change, of seasons, of the appropriateness of one behavior in one context over another, that you can't do something 24/7. I mean, I even think about the Oscars. that yeah, I'm sure you heard about the conflict. Maybe you didn't. I don't know. But
Terrible. Yeah.
yeah, it is. But I mean, why are we even celebrating the Oscars as Ukraine is being devastated by Russia? Like to some extent, it's like, couldn't we collect the brilliance and collective mind bandwidth of so many other people for something more meaningful and productive? And I think to some extent, like it just speaks to the same thing. It's like why is our society comfortable with some type of like dance off during a funeral? Like that's how I would compare it to. We're doing this like very opulent, luxurious ceremony in a time of global mourning, really. And I don't think our society's comfortable with that. It's very trader oriented, 24/7. We keep going no matter what. Let's get it on the schedule. let's honor it no matter what the context, no matter what's going on in the room next door. And I think that there is something to what you're saying, a sort of spiritual understanding that manifests itself on a fractal scale, and here is it colliding on a global level.
So, I mean, at a very low level, this fractal scale, I don't know the details here, but I've heard that the Navy SEALs and perhaps the Green Beret, as well, that they have in their combat world 4 modes of breathing that they use. And there's a kind of breathing that they use pre-a-mission, then there's a kind of breathing within the mission, a post-breathing mission to come. And I mean, if I were just going to speak specifically as an American, let's say I were a hospital administrator, I think I would ask all my ED department staff to learn these modes of breathing. And there is something, very ancient in all religions. All serious religions have what we call a yoga, which is, I think, related to the Greek word ergo. It's a work, a spiritual practice. But in the American trader context, of course, I would be doing that to get more, bucks out of you guys. And to save having to give you vacations and burn out and losing personnel. But I mean, and so I say that even with some hesitation, because I know in my culture, like that's going to be a thing. I mean, I can, within the next 2 years, probably you and I will hear about some place where they're bringing in consultants from the Navy SEALs to teach breathing techniques to frontline healthcare workers.
Yeah. No,
yeah. And what they say about special forces operators, whether it's in the Air Force or now that the Marines have them too, is that when crisis strikes, their adrenaline rises less than the average person, their adrenaline and heart rate, and when crisis ends, it returns to normal faster. And it's that persistent state of mobilization for defense and adrenaline that is almost the definition of post-traumatic stress. But some jobs there's nothing post about it. That's what we want you to do on a daily basis, is to be mobilized in that way, right? Much as if I would ask a truck driver to drive 16 hours a day. I mean, he's gonna have to be amped up on uppers and caffeine and psyching himself up with music and all that stuff. But special forces operators, they don't berserk. I mean, if they do, whoosh, right? A frontline soldier might do that and persist, say an infantryman in Vietnam, but special forces guys, no, that's not happening.
So you mention in your book that 85% of soldiers that were, the average man, let's say, drafted into many of these battles throughout human history, one way or another, they found out 85% of them in some way would try to avoid shooting their enemy. That they found it just that distressing. However, 15% evidently were quite able to process through that. I thought it was interesting that there are about 2 million men in our armed forces today, of the many millions that could potentially be drafted. And you wonder sometimes, are we getting that 15% that shows up to the task? And is that allowing our armed forces to be more able, and then you talk about special forces. I mean, there's even another cut of special types of people, you know.
So yeah, so I know the statistic through Grossman. I can't remember his first name, but he was a U.S. Army Ranger and also a psychologist. And he wrote a book called On Killing. So I through that lens, I know the research. I don't have, you know, a background on it. But this idea that 85% of frontline soldiers are typically non-firers, it's mysterious. I mean, it seems so counterintuitive. I just could not imagine myself being a non-firer in an environment where an alien army is pouring over, and I'm with, you know, you and me and 20 of our best friends. I just don't see that. So it's hard, a little hard to know what to make of that statistic. For example, perhaps it's somehow something that we create together. In other words, at some psychological level, when many of the people I'm with are firing, I use that opportunity to busy myself with other things. Whereas if they weren't, maybe I would fire. I don't know. I don't know if it's an individual thing. Certainly militaries in general are not made up of, you know, principally of frontline troops. They're made up of vast logistical chains and all kinds of things happening behind the scenes. Very few people. And when I saw Black Hawk Down, you know, in the theater, I thought, what is this absurdity? All these white American soldiers shooting all these black people. And then, you know, it slowly dawned on me, although, you know, African Americans are doubly or triply represented in the army from what they are, and they're going to the army for jobs. They're going to the army to learn a trade, supplement their schooling, get ahead. It's the white guys who are in there looking for action and volunteering for, you know, airborne and then Rangers, and there's something in that
process, you know.
There's something in that Scots-Irish Anglo-American heritage of combat that, you know, gives it. So there's a self-selection process of who wants to be in those positions. Very hard to predict who will fire. And then Grossman's point is that the Army after World War II discovered this non-firer problem and said, we're not going to train people, we're going to condition people to fire. And that maybe they've gotten the rates up, but we don't know with what impact. But it says something spiritually, and of course that's where I come in as a theologian, to say, yeah, people don't really want to kill, even at the loss of their own life. I mean, people are, by and large, very good.
Yeah,
all over the world.
No, you're absolutely right. It speaks to the point that the average man or woman in these high stakes situations still has such an intuitive conflict, a battle, a dissonance, that they can't even complete their mission, although rationally they know they need to. And then it sort of speaks then to why when people do murder, or, you know, whatever the term you want to use, you know, shoot their enemy, or kill their enemy, that there is a spiritual cost. And you know, just like we know that when there's fire and you touch it, you're going to eventually get burned. I mean, we know that association, and people inherently have this idea that if they do murder or kill, they're going to be burned in the process. You know, I think that's what it tells me. There's an intuition that is prophetic about the ultimate outcome.
Yes, I think that's true. And although everyone's different, and it's really hard to say, you know, whether the impact. Some people after the first kill of a fellow human being will vomit or be sick, and then afterwards they're okay. Other people, you know, maybe in that 15% minority seem to be okay, some for the long term, but maybe later on in life, you know, as they get towards their own death from old age, they start thinking more and more, they see the faces and they feel some kinship of specific people that they killed. And St. Basil said that we do not, you know, regard killing in a legitimate war as murder, but we definitely recognize, and the term now is we use as moral injury, that somehow, but ancient societies called blood guilt. You know, it's somehow, hey, it's rough, man. It's really rough.
I thought it was so so interesting how in your book you
Which
mentioned,
which is why we don't want euthanasia in our medical profession.
yeah, sure.
We have enough problems with frontline healthcare worker burnout. We don't also need them to asphyxiate terminally ill people.
Yeah, no,
It's
that's
so
an,
laughable. If you know
yeah,
anything about trauma and war, it is just the most absurd academic idea ever.
it,
Just totally dumb.
it is, and it's especially when you see it through those lenses, you see how never mind the person who just gets knocked off, but all the people surrounding that bed making that occur, they are going to feel a spiritual injury from that process, and
Yeah,
whether rationally or not. Although I will, again, euthanasia and allowing people who are 95 to die of pneumonia, not to break the ribs doing CPR and intubating them, sometimes it's a whole conversation. But
yes, this is sort of through neglect, and it's a different story to withhold care versus to actively administer.
Yeah, me traveling on a first class ticket to Oregon, to sign up for a death that, to me isn't going to occur for 2 more years for my terminal brain cancer, but I'd like to just die today to get it over with. That seems like euthanasia, and probably not a good idea.
I mean,
I think that was a scenario.
We're just human beings, and we're trying to create a society without God. And maybe we hear that through the lens of American Christianity, that our elites ridicule all the time as a bunch of troglodyte moralists or something. But to create a society without God means that every one of us bears a huge existential burden that is actually, in fact, beyond our strength.
Yes.
That's really what we're doing. Okay, so go ahead and be as irreligious as you like and an atheist as you like, but we're creating a world where we're asking people to carry burdens that the created human being cannot carry, and what will be the result of that long term? It's just not sustainable, and that's a very good catch-all phrase. Something will break, and most likely many things will break as a result of asking people, you're not Atlas, you cannot carry the world on your back. You need divine assistance and the possibility of divine help, and you need divine forgiveness just to be a normal human being. I mean, yes, okay, we can all, I can stay up late, 6 nights in a row, 10 nights in a row. Eventually, I'm going to have to catch up on my sleep.
Yeah.
And lots of people can live without God for decades or whatever. Mm-hmm. Eventually, this does not work either for them or the people around them or their society. It's just not sustainable because you're not God.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there are situations in medicine in particular where we deal with death all the time, where if you don't have something else to reference beyond yourself and all of its arbitrariness and fleeting attention and physiological limitations, you just, if you really feel like you're the one making the decision. It's funny, actually, now that you say that, I've noticed myself that the most difficult cases I've had is when there's no real clear protocol. Like if you can just stick to the protocol, you feel like, okay, at least I've done standard of care, the best practice medicine. But in these are many situations where there is no particular protocol, you can feel very isolated and alone. And if you don't have anything to reference as a higher order good standard, then you're just left with your own self, and you're just kind of like, wow, that was exhausting. But let me give you an example. This is kind of a funny story. I was in medical school, and we were talking about this concept of young infants, and they called it a yellow code, evidently, in some hospitals. I don't know where this term came from, but basically, you see a hopeless situation, someone should get CPR, and all these different techniques and interventions, and you just kind of do it half-assed, for lack of a better term. And you just let the inevitable occur. Documentation-wise, the patient got CPR. Documentation-wise, they got certain things. But so it's kind of a troubling term to know that even exists. But anyway, there was a situation where there was a baby that we were talking about, a case study where there was a child born like at 21 weeks, was never going to survive, and this was like an old case, so it's barely possible now, wasn't possible then. And the ethical dilemma that they brought up to us in the group was, hey, this baby was born. It's inevitable that it's going to die at some point. If it goes off any one of the machines, it's done. When do we pull the plug? Like, what's the answer? And everyone had their different opinions. I couldn't come up with a better justification other than saying at the time, hey, in my religious tradition, which I understand is a minority of understandings, we would probably like to get this child to the 8th day so we could read certain prayers that occur the 8th day, get him baptized, and let the inevitable occur after that, like for the sake of the spiritual well-being and sacraments of what that child can partake of. Let's at least get him there. So suddenly this guy to my left stands up and he says, I was that child. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, I was born at, it wasn't 21 weeks, but I was born at like 30 weeks or so. I'm paraphrasing now. It seemed like my existence would be futile, or my outcome would be poor. The staff said, we should just pull the plug on this little one right now. And the family said, hey, we're going to keep this child alive till we get a priest to come and bless him and baptize him, and then we'll see what happens. And lo and behold, this priest comes, and whether or not you want to say it was from the prayers that were read or whatever, but the faith of these people allowed that child to just live, survive.
It's so great.
And that real story, man, later on, that same child became a doctor, is taking care of people right now. I mean, not every situation is like that, but it goes to show that, like, I'm sure you could have spent the next 50 years of your life trying to figure out when we should pull the plug on an infant child, but here are some parameters, and it's like, oh my God, I feel like a burden is taken off me. Let's get to the 8th day. Let's get to the 8th day with all ferocity. Baptize this child and let him go and see what happens. And you feel a sense of certainty with the effort to get to the 8th day and the stepping back afterwards. I feel like that is powerful.
Right, because there's a Sabbath worked in there, right? Like we're gonna work and then we're gonna rest. We're gonna put it in God's hands, in other words. And also, God gave Moses 10 commandments, but he gave him 10,000 rules for ritual order. Mm-hmm. And without those protocols, which is, our ritual, like we really are drifting. And, who can say, did we adhere to the proper standard of care? But also, I think it's interesting time, because, in a trader, a society that's so reflexively about the bottom line and the merchant modality all the time, right? Everything's a rush. And here, just saying, no, time is its own, reward. It's like, how many occurrences are there? Even, to say something controversial, the George Floyd thing. I watched George Floyd being, dying at the hands of those police. And I thought that if I had been there, I won't finish the sentence, I would have intervened. And I won't say more than that. But then 6 months later, a year later, it turned out, this technique of leaning on someone's neck was actually taught to the police as a legitimate, well, only with due process does that come out. And but no, I would say when I initially saw the video, I was 100 times angrier than the second most angry person I knew about that. And I felt, certain that I would have, intervened. So the guardian realm does create that possibility of due process, which is its own kind of protocol, and a protocol that can't be rushed through time. No, it's a 30-day waiting limit, or it's a 15-day cooling period, or whatever it is. And it's really in respecting both syndromes that liturgy arises, and we allow this third force of love to enter and into society and permeate it and leaven it. But anyway, this is not really what chapter 1 is about, but that's okay. We can come back to chapter 1.
Oh no, just great stuff. And again, the way that a single chapter that you write can speak to this concept of war, and how that concept of war is played out, like you said, in fractals on the microcosm for all of us in so many different industries, contexts, situations. I mean, life is a war, and it's a conflict, and you know,
That's certainly
speaking,
part. Yeah.
but speaking to your point, kind of in summary, I mean, that major point that you bring up in the beginning, that these Orthodox lands supporting their soldiers to help them with that inevitability of spiritual injury, moral injury, and we're going to build them up right now to give them reserve. It kind of reminds me, again, I'm jumping here, but you hear about these people doing psilocybin, mushrooms, and they're having these hallucinogenic experiences, and they have almost sounds spiritual experiences. But when the intellectual from Johns Hopkins gives this guy, this shroom, and he says, hey, when this black cloaked figure starts talking to you about the meaning of the universe, go be exploratory, try to explain. I'm quoting, things that I've heard that these doctors are doing.
Sure.
I mean, could you imagine if an ascetic from Mount Athos was talking to you about encountering the spiritual world, what different advice he'd give you? He wouldn't be telling you, please, explore and be creative and envision peace. I mean, there are so many tools in our faith that we have to support and strengthen the soul through these extreme experiences beyond our intellectual rationalism. And
let me just jump in there and say something about
Yes.
orthodoxy that doesn't get said enough. In her 1968 book, The Economy of Cities, Jane Jacobs had this, she played with this idea, and she dropped it over the next 15 years, but she played with this idea that there always had to be a parent city, that almost an Aristotelian idea that it's recursive, infinitely back, that there always had to be a mother city. Now, she equally had the idea that for a city to develop economically, it needed most of all vigorous trade with other cities who were also developing and were more or less at its level. But this notion of the mother city, the metropolis, also remained important for her work. So New York City's mother is London. London's real mother and cityhood is Venice. And Venice's real mother is Constantinople, or New Rome, and her mother is Rome. And then to find the parent city or the mother city of Rome, maybe we go into the Etruscan past or what have you. Now, each of these cities, as they've developed, have acquired, a fund of know-how on every single aspect of life we can imagine, from how to cook food to how to quiet a baby, right? And how to manufacture tools, and some of these Roman medical instruments. I mean, they look so precise, look just like our forceps and things like that. Now, one of these cities dies and enters its own dark age, there's a mass forgetting. So what orthodoxy gives you is a link through the dark ages to a much bigger fund of human insight. That's what we're preserving. Okay, yes, it's the true faith, and I believe that. But I would like to make just a secular argument that the reason you want to come into the Orthodox Christian world is because among Christian faiths, it's the one that is going to just peer more deeply and have the largest fund of human know-how. Now, this doesn't mean other Christianities don't have something to offer, but a mature, but coming into the most mature faith gives you the standpoint to embrace that other stuff, right? Like in the book, I'm a little bit negative about just war theory, but just war theory, first of all, the Chinese had just war theories, very developed by the time of Plato. And we had to wait for Aquinas, in the 13th century. But But it's the basis of international law today. Is Aquinas' just war theory? It's all about these rules for those things are wonderful. It doesn't eliminate moral injury and traumatic response, but it does. They are helpful things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you might say that to some extent you need to motivate the soldiers to believe that this effort, this sacrifice is worthwhile, and at the same time rationally acceptable. But at the same time, you have to understand that as you mentioned, the beauty first principle that this act in of itself will take a cost. No matter how rational we can be in hiding its cost, we still feel it. We still feel it, and there's a reality there, a spiritual reality there that we can't hide away from or intellectualize away.
When you kill in war, most of the people you kill will be more or less innocent, more or less good people. I mean, I'm talking about the soldiers.
Yeah.
And the motivations and the intentions of your own leaders will be so mixed up with their own passions and sins. And you go to war with some trepidation as a soldier, and you have to know that it's mostly nonsense. But at least I will defend the people to my right and left, and I will do the best I can to bring this thing to a quick conclusion, and without demonizing my opponent, because for Shea, that demonization of the enemy will greatly increase your own, because it's a built-in excommunication, right? Mm-hmm. When you excommunicate the other, you excommunicate yourself too. I mean, there's just no two ways around. There's no. Yeah.
I love the way that you describe as victory as a more certain and quick way to peace. It's like we're just trying to win this to get it over. Like we're just trying to get to peace, and that's
sort it out.
Yeah, I mean it really goes to show. I mean that's what we're after. We're trying to restore the general order of things, and we just want to get there as quickly as possible.
At the end of this war between Russia and Ukraine will not move to a different continent. Mm-hmm. It will still, and they will not become a different linguistically or ethnically people. Mm-hmm. They will still be, they will still have to work with Russia, and Russia will have to learn to respect and work with them. And so, we're trying to wrap this thing up here and get back to the discussion phase of things and to the patience phase of things. Because right now, I mean, I didn't watch today's news, but, missiles are falling and tons of innocent people are having their lives turned upside down or ended or maimed. It's really sad and wrong. And we should be floating some kind of a peace plan immediately and just get back to the discussion table. I mean, I know they are discussing, but we don't need to be killing each other in the meantime.
Yeah, and such a sad thing, two Orthodox nations, fighting against one another. What a great cost and tragedy that is. I wanted to go back to this last point before we wrap up, and like I said, it's just the first chapter, and I feel like I'm barely scratching the surface of its implications and its applicability to so many other things. It's beautiful work, Uncle Tim. You talk about how in the Vietnam War they made a mistake. They used to take individuals out of their cohort and sort of recycle them, and how this idea of them not being with an assigned group over time really devastated someone. That brotherhood, that camaraderie, as they became more, if I'm paraphrasing right or summarizing right, this really forced a systemic outcome of isolation among individual soldiers.
Sure. In other words, for the listener, in Vietnam, you were drafted, you went through basic training and whatever other supplemental training you were due to receive. And let's say you were a combat infantryman, you flew to Vietnam and then got on a helicopter, and you were just deposited with some unit, maybe even in the field or back at its base, more likely. And you're the only new guy. And then 365 days later, and they later extended that to 13 months, your time was short and your time was up. And then a helicopter came and you said goodbye to everyone, and you just went, and 48 hours later, you were back in the south end of Boston or wherever you're from
which creates an excommunication. You're literally, you've created a systemic process to encourage men to unravel and isolate and create more opportunities for post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, that's what it seems a recipe for, as you just.
Yes. So under the influence of Shea, I think it's, as far as I can tell, it is Jonathan Shea's influence, and that the military said, okay, there was a lot of learning. You know, I think the last great general of the Vietnam War was this General Harold Abrams, and he was just good on every level. And when he left Vietnam at the close of things in '73 or whenever he left, he became chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs for the whole military. And he was a true statesman, and he redesigned the military so that we would always use the reserves. And he set in motion getting rid of these very efficient and very kind of trader, like people are interchangeable little cogs in a factory, and threw that out the window. So in Iraq, you train with your unit, you go in your unit, you come out, and that's what we've been doing. But why do you bring that up? Because it's I'm sure, I mean, you look at Band of Brothers, right? Those guys were together for 2 years before they went into combat. 2 years of hard training. And there wasn't a lot of turnover. I mean, it was them. And then they stayed together for the whole war. And then they stayed together, in that final episode of Band of Brothers, playing baseball in Austria, wherever the heck that was, for another 4 or 5 months. Then everyone was sown to the winds, and they still grieved it. This guy left here, and this guy stayed on in the army, and this guy, and it was sad as can be. And that's why they kept getting together. And the biggest brother, the Lancaster guy, Lancaster, PA guy, like your family, he kept them meeting, regularly, forever, until he died.
It's so powerful. It's so powerful. There is something about that camaraderie that is sustaining. And I know that in my own emergency department experience. Thank God I don't have to worry about bullets going towards me. But, I don't know. I'd like to do some statistic watching. Have I seen more people die than the average army man? I'm not sure.
Oh, yes.
I'm
sure.
Not, you think
sure.
so?
Well, most people don't even approach the front. 70% of people, whatever it is, don't go anywhere near the front. So it's really, yes, of course, yeah.
Uncle Tim,
time's up though. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, this has been great, and I would love to do follow-up conversations about this in time. I do want to emphasize that Dr. Timothy Patitsas wrote a fantastic book, The Ethics of Beauty, and it's a beauty-first approach, which is which is ever more missing in our day and age. And we don't it doesn't just talk about war; it talks about all sorts of concepts within the modern day that are just so resonating and mind-blowing, and it's a paradigm shift. But I think the first chapter we barely touched the surface, but it was a powerful conversation. I thank you very much for giving me your time, Uncle Tim. I know you're very busy. Well,
and God bless anyone who listened to this, and in particular, if anyone is has suicidal ideation. Of course, I mean, what's the protocol there? You've got to get help and reach out, and to know that if you are feeling really hard pressed upon in your life, let's say it's suicide, we're not talking that, but just that probably the people around you are too, and can be the basis for a beautiful camaraderie and love for each other, that you're going through something hard together. Maybe it's just the whole country through COVID, but let's have some pride in that, in our suffering.
Yeah, that liturgy in that community is so sustaining. I look forward to reading the rest of the book, Uncle Tim. Thank you so much.
Talk to you soon.